Thank you as we just work out the bugs in our annual online virtual lecture. It's good to see everyone showing up for this evening. My name is Tom Hand. I am the chapter president of Vermont ASLA, so the Vermont chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects, and we are hosting, I'm going to say hopefully the last time virtually, our annual Doug Crowell lecture. It's our annual lecture in the fall where we try to bring experts and interesting folks in the world of landscape architecture and other topics together. And we're excited to have all of you here, as well as our panel of experts in landscape architecture and Olmsted to continue the celebration of Olmsted 200. So the bicentennial celebration of Olmsted's birth, which has been happening this entire year. And VTASLA has been presenting various exhibitions and lectures, and Patricia's been gracious enough to give some tours of Shelburne Farms. And we also have, I believe, a film coming up shortly as part of the Architecture and Design film series about Olmsted and his work. So there's a lot happening kind of within Vermont and across the country to celebrate Olmsted. Tonight, we're bringing an exemplary panel together. Patricia O'Donnell is moderating our group of speakers tonight. She's of Heritage Landscapes. And we have Laurie, Olin, Dede, Petri, and Marion Pressley coming here with us to discuss Olmsted's legacy. And I'm very excited. We had a little call earlier today with a bit of a preview of the discussion. It's bound to be lively. I'm really looking forward to it. As we discussed in our announcement of the event, we are offering CEUs, so continuing ed credits. We just ask that you stay through the event and follow up by emailing the chapter, which I believe is vtasla@gmail.com, to let us know that you're interested in having us send you the continuing ed form for this evening's panel discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patricia and the rest of our panel, and thank you all for coming.
Excellent, thanks, Tom. We're happy to be here. And Laurie Olin, as many of you know, is nationally and internationally important landscape architect with a huge legacy of work, including some projects in the Olmsted legacy realm. Dede Petri is our NAOP executive director and Olmsted 200 organizer with her team, has been doing a magnificent job of bringing Olmsted to the broader public. And Marion Pressley, a very well-known professional with decades of work in historic landscapes and some important work, particularly on Olmsted's legacy in Massachusetts, but elsewhere, and has a long-standing project interest in the Emerald Necklace. So I welcome my co-participants this evening, and I'm going to do a little overview of Olmsted for those of you who may not know about this amazing guy. He was born in Hartford, Connecticut, April 26, 1822, died on the 28th of August in 1903. There's a really great children's book about him, which is terrific for kids trying to figure out where they want to go in life, because it says he kind of had a peripatetic career with a little journalism, some social critic, a little scientific farming, and then some public administration, and eventually he becomes, with Calvert Vaux, the father of the landscape architecture profession, so named when they had a contract to work on the actual implementation of the plan for Central Park. If you look up Olmsted USA, you find several maps that have lots of interesting symbols and dots of the works across the United States. There are some 500 works credited to Frederick Olmsted Sr. and some 6,000 to the firm, which included John Charles Olmsted, his stepson, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., his heir and namesake, Charles Elliott, Harry Codman, Percival Gallagher, James Frederick Dawson, and a number of others over the years of the firm to create that 6,000 some projects. They had the largest studio in the United States and worked out of Brookline, and their kind of lifestyle was trains and hotels to get to their projects all over the country. Probably the most important and well-known is Central Park and the Greensward Competition Plan of 1858, built out with Olmsted and Vaux under their direct control until about 1873. It's 341 hectares, about some 800 plus acres. And this plan comes forward after the competition, this particular drawing. It's not the competition drawing, but it's in part because Calvert Vaux invites Olmsted and persists
I'm having trouble.
invitation when he was the park superintendent under Edgar Veal, who did not win the competition. So when you think about Central Park, you really kind of recognize this view. I'm going to compare and contrast these historic and contemporaries. This is a Getty image, and it was envisioned at the time that there would be a future moment when the city completely framed the park. And there are 42 million annual park users, according to the Central Park Conservancy, in a city of 8.8 million. This is a rare image that I found a number of years ago at the Library of Congress of a 1919 aerial of the US Capitol grounds. And you can see the plain wing here in the view on the left. Olmsted Sr. was brought to the Capitol grounds in 1874, worked there as the head of the design team until 1891. They were responsible, for example, for the development of these terraces and the west approach, which are often thought to be connected to the architecture. But when Olmsted walked on the site, the two wings had been added and there was no landscape shaped around the Capitol at that time. Today, the Capitol is on axis with the National Mall. The original plan for Union Square, not what exists today, and the mall were both designed and deeply influenced by Frederick Olmsted Jr. as a part of the ongoing legacy. Jackson Park is another important work. It's the site of the World Columbian Exposition, and this is the revised general plan for rebuilding the park, which is undertaken by Olmsted, and Elliott in 1895. And a recent image of a project we completed a few years ago with the Chicago Park District shows the transition into native and to nature and to habitat of this testing of a sedge lawn as opposed to a turf grass lawn. Another important initiative of Olmsted and the team is Olmsted and Vaux first sorting out city shaping with parks and parkways. This is the earliest plan. It's the Buffalo plan of the parkway system and the three first initial parks. And then today, something recent from the Olmsted Parks Conservancy connecting three of the parks and providing a bikeway along parts of the parkways, but also city streets. The necklace is possibly one of the most important of the city shaping works, the Emerald Necklace. and that's through the 1880s. And you can compare and contrast this contemporary plan for the Olmsted Emerald Necklace with the historic one I just showed. The legacy continues across the country with works in Baltimore, with planning an overall park system in Birmingham. An early work is the development of Riverside and the general plan for Riverside, and a contemporary plan of Yosemite Valley. Olmsted, as we all know, this year, a nice book by Karen Diamant brings forward the connection between the national parks and conservation and the Olmsted legacy. Some of the issues that are relevant, I think, are going to be on topic this evening. For example, the Central Parks Conservancy shows this site of this former Seneca village, and the African-American village that was next to the reservoir in the park prior to the work of Olmsted and Vaux in shaping the park. The village was removed. So there are a number of interesting issues about erasure or suppressed histories. And then we come into the kinds of issues that are relevant today, with Central Park being home to 20,000 trees and delivering ecosystem services. So with that overview, I would like to offer a view of perhaps the speakers. I'm not sure how we do this in your view, Elena, to highlight Laurie, Dede, Marion, and I.
Oh, we made it.
Yeah. So we're framed by the other participants, but hopefully that introduction gave you some background for the breadth and depth of the contributions of Frederick Law Olmsted to the United States. And I think it would be great if we could begin a discussion with each of you speaking about the importance of Olmsted's work as a landscape architect after his various other careers, which of course contributed to how he pursued landscape architecture. Dede, do you want to give that one a start?
I don't know if you can hear me, because
Laurie, we can hear you. We've heard you several times. Can you hear us?
from time to time, yeah, I can hear you. From time to time, you break up. I don't know why I have a lame connection, but I guess I'll just begin by saying that Olmsted is one of my heroes. And, you know, we think of him as the founder of the creation of the field of landscape architecture in the US. And, but it's really his vision about how to ameliorate the life of the citizens of the country and the difficulties that he found with the cities. You know, Olmsted was a reformer in an age of reformers. He followed on a period of a number of revolutions. And there were all sorts of people who were trying to figure out how to improve life. Some of them were trying to do it economically, you know, the socialists in Europe and various Marxists and all kinds of people. There were other people trying to do things through government and through, you know, there were changes in art and poetry, all sorts of things. And Olmsted's decision was finally, after a long, odd preparation, was to improve cities and the way people lived and how to bring nature to them. He had concluded from his own experience that nature was something that we needed. And I'll stop there, but I think his biggest contribution was explaining and proving through his own work that men, women, and children need nature, and they need it in their homes and in their lives, and how to bring that to cities. And of course, that led him to parks.
That's excellent. Thank you. Dede?
Sure. Well, Laurie started by saying that Olmsted was one of his heroes. So I'll start by saying I'm amongst heroes of mine. Here we have all these incredible Olmsted experts, and I look forward to learning tonight by being a part of this discussion. I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Laurie said. I mean, he, I think, emphasizes rightly that it was a period of reform. And I have found that as I've lived with this man for the last 18 and 20 months, to be increasingly fascinated by him as a small d Democrat. I mean, I think obviously we appreciate his many incredible landscapes, but I think to me, he plays such an important role by thinking creatively and extensively about the way public spaces, whether they were urban or national parks, could advance America's democratic principles. And you mentioned the wonderful new book, Olmsted and Yosemite by Ethan and Rolf. And I think it really raises some very, very interesting issues as we think about that time in which Olmsted lived. I mean, pre and post-bellum America, deeply divided, significant immigration, pandemics. I mean, I like to say it's almost eerie, the parallels to today. And I think that thinking about his work as he decides to bring people together through landscape, having seen Birkenhead Park, one of the very first public parks, open to all, regardless of background. And he has that aha moment that this is a democratic development. And I think it's that continued development of that notion, whether it's through Central Park, which he views as a democratic experiment, or the Yosemite Report, where he actually calls out the pursuit of happiness, invoking the Declaration of Independence, in talking about everyone's right to nature. So to me, his expansion and advancement of the democratic experiment through the built environment is incredibly interesting and worthy of study.
Excellent. Marion, your viewpoint?
Yeah, I'm maybe a little more cynical, but in any case, I always go back in history when I look at things, and I see Olmsted as a man who was in the right place at the right time. He had a good basis. He did his trips to Britain in 1850. He saw Birkenhead Park. He saw the other parks, the royal parks. He became familiar with the European park systems. And so by 1858, he's entering, or 1857, he's entering a competition. He's smart enough to get a good architect on his team. He's put together a really good team to go after this. They do a fantastic rendering, beautiful drawings. And, you know, it's really a man who, as I said, was in the right place at the right time. And it's because before that, in the 1830s, 1840s, even a little later, people were doing the grand tours of Europe. And we were clamoring at this point in New York to have a park. And so I think I see a man who knew how to take advantage of opportunities and did them well. He looked at other people's work, he brought it into his own realm, and he created his own parks.
Excellent. I'm busy adding to the chat as a part of the LACES EEUs. I think it's CEUs. I think it's important to have some narrative to go along with what we're saying here. So, and it gives people a reference. For those of you who've done Zoom a lot, you of course know that you can copy the chat and keep it. I'm doing the typing, but I'm starting it with each of our presenters' names. So our next question, for a little bit of elaboration from each of you, is about what was it that Olmsted in his designs, perhaps for parks, because these are certainly the best known, but also other examples can be drawn on. What did he do right, and what do we have to fix today? You want to be top of the order, Laurie, and take that one on?
Oh, there it is.
You're muted.
You're muted.
I can unmute.
There.
I missed your question.
Okay, Laurie, the question is about what did Olmsted do right?
She's frozen again. So are you all.
Uh-oh.
All right,
says-
so you're back on.
Okay, well, it says I'm unstable, which is believable. It's my connection for some reason. I will blame a local utility. What were you wondering?
The wondering is about what he did right that we can point to in his
Oh.
works, and what were the things that we now
Well-
maybe have to go back and fix.
Well,
Or
I think it's very clear that he understood that to work at the scale of the problem at the time that he was dealing with it, that there were so many people living too close together, and he needed to produce large open spaces large enough for the community that was going to come. And that's a problem that we need to be doing today, is working at the scale of our problem. He understood that the dilemmas of pollution. And so he worked on that in terms of working with floodways and trying to develop housing that was reasonable for in terms of health. He understood a whole bunch of things that are extremely important in terms of the design of communities. The notion, he believed deeply in individual freedom and in the family as the basic building block of society, but he felt that people deserve privacy, but they must have community. And so how to do that in the layouts of his developments was something he always emphasized, was what they shared in the common streets, and then what they had privately for themselves. So he understood this thing that de Tocqueville was worried about in democracy, of the individual versus the group. So he was operating at a sociologically sophisticated level while dealing with the technology of his own day and with the politics of his time. And that's something he did, and something we need to do, is work with whatever we've got to work with, our people, our politics, our technology, but also on the problems that, guess what? They're the same problems. They're still the problems of health first, and then next comes spirit, and community. So he did many things right, but I think scale was something he understood. Like trees, lots of trees, thousands of trees, amplitude. He understood amplitude, which was something he got from nature. Nature is
Breaking up.
more trees. And Olmsted, I think, had that same generosity of spirit, which I think is, if there's anything to learn from him, it's generosity of spirit.
Excellent, thank you.
I'll mute myself and hope I stay with you.
We hope so too, Laurie. Dede.
Well, that was just so wonderful. I'm not sure that I can really expand on it, but I do think that Laurie's emphasis on thinking at the scale of the problem, cross-jurisdictional, really thinking beyond the city into the metropolitan area, certainly something that Charles Eliot was then working on. And I think the ability to think of civil society, Laurie was mentioning Tocqueville. I think that's a perfect reference in the context of Olmsted, because he saw in the South there was no vibrant civil society, and he felt that was really essential to moving us forward as a nation. And parks, vibrant parks, were to become part of that civil society, part of the educational context in which we would all find ourselves. And I think the generosity of spirit, again, another wonderful way to think about Olmsted, despite numerous efforts at numerous professions, he was never disturbed by failure. As his friends said, he was an optimist at heart. He just picked himself up and went on. And I think it was that openness, that optimism that really then can be seen in his parks, because these were the embodiment of the future distant effects that he hoped would come to pass, and we are all the beneficiaries.
Excellent. Thank you. So Marion, what do you think?
Okay, what I'd like to
Right,
talk,
and what have we got to still be fixing?
all right, what I'd like to talk about is, I think one of the things that he did that was really right, especially towards the end of his career, was actually understanding that the single park was not the answer in all cases, no matter how big, but that the system, a park system, a system of parks, a system of avenues connecting them, was really what a city needed. And he did this in several cities. The Necklace happens to be a prime example of that, starting in 1878 when he starts the Fens, Franklin Park, and then finally by 1892, 93, 1895, the park system is complete with the other parks being built. And the system has held together. It's a very strong thing. It moves through the whole community. So instead of just being a single park, which has just a population around it, in the case of the Necklace or ones that he did in Buffalo or that he did in Baltimore and other cities, it moves through the city and the park system moves through the city. And so I think that was one of the really great things that he did and puts him beyond the fact of somebody just doing a park. And I don't know how we correct it, or what's really important is that we don't lose it. We have to make sure that we keep that kind of thing. We can't lose the avenues. We can't turn them into commuting highways. We have to keep the sort of rhythm that he created, the size, the different forms. He, of course, with the Necklace starts with a large park. He goes through the lake, the pond, he goes down through the river system. He ends up finally in the Fens and into the salt area. And I think that was very, very strong. And I think it's why the Necklace still works today, because it's not just a park for one neighborhood, it's a park for the entire city.
Yeah, if I could leap in here, I think it's interesting to look at park score by the Trust for Public Land. 6 out of the 12 parks that are in the top 12 have an Olmsted connection. And I think Boston is the one and only one where everyone is within a 10-minute walk of the park, which is, of course, obviously a goal for many cities. But Olmsted was ahead of the time. And as you say, Marion, the Emerald Necklace was a perfect example of connecting different communities through these green spaces, and something that we've really benefited from during the pandemic.
Right, it's a 7-mile trip.
And an accessible one. I mean, one of the terminologies that has arisen in recent years is the notion of a park shed. What is the accessibility? And as Dede notes, it's the 10-minute walk, the 15-minute walk at the outside, and then, do you have areas of a city that are park deprived?
Right.
So
and he also kept up with the system of vehicles, of the horses, which were part of it, and the pedestrians go through the whole system just as they did in Central Park. And that's still very viable in terms of those 3 modes are still very much in place.
Okay.
and
Well,
then
and it's nice to, and I'll give Marion a call out here because I'm sure she's been involved. If we look at the Arborway and some of the improvements going on in Boston now, they're attempting to make certain that those circulatory paths are actually safe and that bicyclists can survive through the Emerald Necklace and that pedestrians can as well. So it's a wonderful example of how cities really are embracing that Olmsted spirit as they attempt to improve various aspects of their park system.
So each of you were pretty complimentary. You didn't pick up the second part of the question, which was what did he not do well?
You want me to tell you?
Well, I'm going to start it if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
One of the things we've often been engaged in is having Olmsted landscapes meet the current accessibility standards. So meeting the 5% or less continuous gradient for a walk without handrails, meeting the 8.33 or less when needed for
There's a lot of stairs.
accessibility. There are really a lot of stairs.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I think one of the other things that we've found that we're often addressing is that the understanding in the second half of the 19th century and even in the early 20th century with the continuing work of the firm of ecology was fairly limited.
Mhm.
So there is an ecological understanding that has evolved over time. They did use quite a few native plants. In Prospect Park in particular, there were records of not orders, but train loads of ferns and small trees being brought in from the woodland to plant
Right.
in Prospect Park. But there also were invasive species, exotics that appeared to be good hardy plants because they were relying on plants. So I would just point out accessibility and plant selection and ecological understanding as more developed today than then, and would like to ask you to further explore this notion of what do we have to fix and what do we now think of differently and have to fine tune.
Well, one thing is that water is the blood of the earth, and Olmsted was devoted to water and to ponds and lakes. So
Frozen.
Yeah.
to the sea. And today we can't quite do that all the time. We can't have water just whatever we want it. We have to, we can't just let it run free. We have to catch it, keep it, reuse it, and we have to do more with it than he and his colleagues were forced to do. They weren't forced to do it, and they didn't have to think about it. And so they were kind of blithe about that. And now, of course, that's a serious problem. The lakes have silted up, and if we need pumps, then the pumps have to be maintained. And so we have some real issues with the water systems that it's not his fault. It's just we now have to outsmart our current situation with them because the water is important and we want to keep it. We have to figure out how to take it forward with the systems we can come up with, I think. And I think that's without telling everybody what to do, because there are so many different possibilities and circumstances. I mean, I think earlier we were talking with Marion about how their first scheme for the Fenways didn't work because they ended up with brackish water and the plants were not salt tolerant. So, and until the Corps of Engineers messed up the Charles River by damming it, then they had fresh water. And of course, then the Charles River couldn't handle stormwater because it was just like a parking lot. But that's another story. So water systems are very difficult. And it's not that they didn't understand things; they understood a heck of a lot more. But they had a different circumstance than we do.
That's a good one, the whole water conundrum, and the fact that we're going forward into a future where we will have less water availability or flooded areas, one or the other. So those problems all have to be dealt with. Thanks for that.
Though, are all on marginal land where people couldn't figure out how to develop right away. And so he figured it, he took advantage of their inability to develop lowland and bottomland and turned a lot of it into great parks. But they regraded a lot to make it dry it out. I see Marion smiling about that. What do you think about that remark, Marion?
Oh, I think it's true. I mean, if we go back to Birkenhead, it was originally a swamp where the park is, and they built the housing around it. I think one of the biggest problems that he had is that there wasn't the knowledge that we have today about plant materials, not only the brackish, the salt water, but they really didn't have an understanding of, they didn't talk about associations of plants. They didn't look at them as that. They also did not really understand the eventual height of many of these things. With the necklace designs, you have high shrubs, low shrubs, medium shrubs, and They just did not understand that Viburnum prunifolium gets big. I mean, they
Really
had it
big.
as a medium shrub. And when you go in to take their planting plans, and which we have extensive plans, we have exactly what he put in, and how many he put in even, we find that the plants really weren't ever going to grow the way he thought they were. So they didn't have the plant knowledge, not only in the salt versus fresh, but the idea of what plants, how they grew, how they were in associations. And he really didn't think about plants that would grow along a river as opposed to what would be at a pond, as opposed to what would be in the fens, as Laurie said, in the salt situation. And I think that, and he did bring in invasives, because if we look at Downing's book, we see at least 3 or 4 invasives that he considered to be perfect plants. And that carried through not only from him, but into that period too. And of course, there's a very fine line between invasive and sustainable, I think, personally.
Well, you know,
But I think he was not a plantsman. And I don't think, he did have people in his firm that were and became more knowledgeable in it.
never do
But
it again, but
Yeah,
no, so, you know, and you learn from your mistakes. I think they learned
Right.
a lot along the way.
sure.
But he did actually understand some things, because one of the things you remember, he said, plant thick and thin often.
Mhm.
The problem is people today are afraid to thin. They won't do it. They won't cut down trees. I was fired by Henry Stern in New York City Park Department because I wanted to cut down some trees, which I considered
Oh, wow.
invasive in the Olmsted plan of Central Park, as a matter of fact. There were a bunch of invasive locusts at the southwest corner.
Yeah.
So, you know, I wanted to get the clearing back so you get some light to the ground, and Henry fired me.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a question of who the commissioner was at the time.
Yeah, he was
Laurie.
a tree hugger, let's face it.
Yeah.
His rule was no tree
Forest.
would be
You know,
cut down.
No, I know, but the business of being tough-minded at the scale of trees in a park, just like people are in a bed in a garden, is something that I think landscape architects need to help people learn about.
Right.
Editing.
You know, the other thing that he had a problem with, yes, he planted close, but they didn't have the place to get materials that we have today. And they planted more, and as you said, take them out afterwards. But it didn't necessarily work. When Blossom went out to a few years after the necklace had been completed and did a survey of everything and what had grown well and what hadn't, and really did a nice analysis of it, I think they learned a tremendous amount at that point. Actually looking at those plans in the Riverway, for instance, are really very, very educational.
Well, and I think Olmsted himself confessed, and I think often felt bad that he was not a better plantsman. I mean, he did not think he was very good on the selection of plants. He wanted his son to be much better and was insistent all through college that he be doing extra studies so that he would learn plants more. And so I think that was clearly a deficiency.
Yeah.
But I also want to say that something that we talked about earlier today is if you look at his advice to Leland Stanford at Stanford, who wanted a beautiful New England garden, he basically said, no, that's not going to work. We have to deal with these semi-arid conditions. We have to plant accordingly. So he did understand that much in a significant way, and was therefore fired as well for his willingness to push back.
Right. But then again, he wanted to have the street trees that were lining the parkway and the necklace, magnolias. He wanted southern magnolias there. He had a lot of, and I'm sure you ran into it in Prospect Park also, Patricia, he did have exotics that he was trying to bring in. And he was, in a way, I think, looking at plants the way the early people's parks did in England. They were really a texture, a study of texture and color. And it wasn't native, or it wasn't trying to create an ecosystem. It was trying to create a composition that was like a painting, and big leaves and small, you know, this is part of what was in those people's parks. And of course, they were done with the idea that they would be an education for the public, to be able to go in and see these plants and start to learn them and know how to use them. And so I think he was building off of ideas that he'd brought back with him too. when he dealt with plants.
Right, and I think you're absolutely right on the aesthetic composition. I mean, we've seen that in numerous Olmsted landscapes where there is the use of plants specifically to create better depth of field.
Yeah,
make it
exactly.
extend the landscape visually, even creating forced perspective relationships, which often happens in estate landscapes.
Right.
I think we have to think what he was pushing back against. He hated the bedding out. He hated a lot of the trends of that day. He didn't want to focus on a single plant or a beautiful floral design. He wanted, again, that sort of mass effect that he loved when he went to California, went through the isthmus, that he even, I think, tried to repeat in South Park when he scoured the countryside of Wisconsin and Illinois, grabbing native plants in hundreds and thousands of them so that he could build these very dense areas along the lagoons for this aesthetic effect.
Yeah,
Right.
he referred specifically to that. As a matter of fact, wrote that big water garden that he planned that never quite happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
The fire of Chicago stopped that part.
So he didn't even get to execute all of his great ideas.
No, it's just it's like a few landscape
Bring
architects I know
back the
today.
Midway Plaisance. That's what I say. I want a canal.
That's it. Well, some things never change. You know, you don't get everything you want.
Exactly.
No, I mean, you have to always be bold. One of the things I think is interesting that we didn't really touch on very much is the Olmsted legacy. While it had a certain approach and a series of principles that it applied, there was a uniqueness that was place-based. The design solutions were related to the location. Do you have any thoughts on this whole notion of, you know, you have your kit of parts, but you come to the work and you make it of this place?
Right.
Well, in many cases, he made the place, if you think about it.
Yeah.
The Emerald Necklace was a totally constructed landscape, as was Central Park.
Right.
I mean, every inch of the Muddy River is a constructed river. He moved it all over the place, and he had to. I mean, wasn't working the way it was. So I don't know. I mean, I think he did construct things. He was trying to construct an ideal landscape with pond and river, and the Muddy is not a river by any means. It's barely a creek, but it's really, it was interesting to see how that is manipulated, how much he moves the land around and creates what he wants. He's not taking a native natural landscape and just working with it. It's he's creating it, basically.
Excellent. Dede, any thoughts on that? This notion of bringing principles, repeating them? Or
No,
Laurie?
I think that's right. I mean, we all talk about the genius of the place. He was really trying to adapt to the place, although as we've heard, he did create from scratch. I mean, you know, if we look at those early pictures of Central Park, I mean, it was not anything to write home about. And so what we see today really was crafted by human hand.
It's an invention. It's art.
Yeah,
it was art. That's right.
It's a work of art, but it happens to be in a medium that's very confusing and difficult called landscape.
and very, very temporary in many ways.
Well, dynamic, I'd say.
Yeah, dynamic and subject to change.
Well, and he has that wonderful passage in Walks and Talks of an American Farmer about how you get to paint this landscape that will not be realized for years to come. And I think, again, he just had that capacity to see what it would look like 50, 75, 100 years later. And I don't think we think that way anymore. And 100-year thinking might be a good thing to import these days.
Doesn't align with mayoral elections or anything like that, but it's always an important objective. Well, it's knowing the target, right? It's knowing what you want it to look like.
But I think we do have to say, and I wrote about this from time to time, that Marion's right. It was an invention because, if he didn't go ask people, what do you want? He didn't go out with clipboards to survey the public. Because if he'd asked the people in 1858 what they wanted up at, sort of 2 miles north of where they live, they wouldn't have had a clue. They wouldn't have come up with a program. He invented it. There's no way the populace of New York could have invented parks.
Yeah, he's really pretty unstable tonight.
He borrowed
He's
things.
unstable today. He's frozen again. I guess.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see if he unfreezes.
But that's right, and I'll leap in. He was doing that, but he also did have a cadre of public officials in city after city who were willing to listen and who were willing to acquire property and who were willing to encourage others to contribute property. I mean, there was a full bore belief in the role of government to support these places as critical infrastructure. And I think he understood them as critical infrastructure in the 19th century. And it's a notion that I think we need to be thinking about now. And I note when Mayor Adams just announced Queens Way, a new linear park in New York City, many of those who were there were talking about parks as critical infrastructure. And I think, again, that's a notion he had that we need to renew and reinvigorate now.
Well, that's why going back to Birkenhead is so important, because I believe it was the first park actually built with public funds.
Mm-hmm.
And all the others were privately built or had come out of the king's, the property of the royals. And I think he understood that immediately. And the housing that was around it, that was built with it, that whole formula that was being done, and not only the different modes of movement that were in Birkenhead, I think he brought home a tremendous amount from that. And if you read his writings and walks and talks, it's really amazing to read and then to go see Birkenhead and realize what he was looking at. And that it was a first, even in England, it was a first that it was public money. Right. And one of the hardest things with the parks, with the people's parks as they progressed, was getting the government to pay for them, to get the structure to pay for them. And they had a really big issue with the money to maintain them after they were built.
Right.
And that was a major issue in the UK with those people's parks. There's lots of literature on it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I was going to say that the part of the economic engine for that, Marion, was the 60 acres of terrace housing that was built also on land taken under eminent domain by the city. To basically help fund Birkenhead in the long run. And when we worked on Battery Park City, one of the interesting things was, although the parks there are much smaller, there is a continuous set of them, but the real estate development that the New York State Agency created put a tax on all the incomes from all the properties to support the open space.
Right.
So the Parks Corporation at Battery Park City is financed by all the properties around it on an annual basis rather well, and it's rather well maintained. They've always had well-trained people and good staff.
Right.
And because it's not like having to ask the people, will you pay for the park? They just do it because that's what the cost of living there,
Well, we had to learn how to do parks and parks departments. That was when you get right down, there's a really interesting story there, and there's a lot of information on it. How do you start forming a parks department? And Central Park is again a good example of how that was developed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think this makes me think of Laurie's wonderful, I think it's his afterword in the Bartholomew Olmsted book, looking at the Los Angeles plan. And what you point out there is that, and this is obviously the Olmsted firm, but I think it was true of Senior as well. They brought an incredible command of municipal finance and an understanding of what was happening on the ground politically. And they also worked with very broad collaborative teams. Again, I think lessons that are still important today. And I mean, that understanding of municipal finance and the suggestions that they would make even regularly as to how to go about doing it, or when to purchase land, or I think was really very sophisticated and important.
I agree.
And I think that's what thank God Junior didn't get into plants and went into planning instead. All those great plans he did for cities across the entire country. I always say to myself, yes, I'm glad you went into planning.
Yeah, he did a good job. He did a lot.
Yeah.
His older brother was also, I thought, one of the great, most skilled designers. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody laid out roads better than JC ever. I mean,
Yeah.
the guy was a genius at how to move a road and to lay
Right.
out lots. I mean, he had an incredible feel. I mean,
Yeah.
the guy was really talented.
Yeah.
And you know, he was like the perfect field man, the perfect designer, and he
Yeah.
spent his life on the road. No wonder he died young.
He was an unsung hero.
Yeah, I think he was absolutely one of the most gifted as a physical designer. I think he really had it.
Yeah.
And he, I think, had an early understanding of native plants. He started thinking about that as he was dealing with some of the moguls, whether it was in Lake Geneva or other places, encouraging them to use the native vegetation and to bring in trees from their forest and plant it into their garden. And so I think he is an unsung hero. And I know Arlene Levy will agree.
Yeah, we all know that. I just want to see the book. Where is it, Arlene?
Oh, it's a long time coming. Laurie, you reminded me of walking the Lake Washington Boulevard and having read, like, the week before I was out there, I don't know, 30 years ago now, having read about the process of laying it out on the ground, and it was JCO who did it, and it was a really interesting layout because it had to hug the shore of Lake Washington and then at various points climb the grade, come into perhaps a small green space and drop back down. And just a shout out to Tony Walmsley, who I worked with at the time many years ago, who's no longer with us, but who really had a good feeling for design on the ground. And that was an excellent example of JCO's work, the Lake Washington Boulevard. That's another amazing park system, and it's all by JCO.
That's JC,
Yeah.
He also, you know, conifers for oaks and stuff like that. And so if you look at Volunteer Park in Seattle, if you translate the Doug firs into oaks and maples, it'll look just like an Eastern park. It's very interesting, the translation of materials that he
yeah.
People are nodding. I can't hear a thing right now.
Yeah, the conifers, and you know, it's really an interesting thing because it's about space shaping.
Right.
Yeah. And it's about using the native trees in those spaces.
Yes.
He wrote a letter, JC wrote a letter to his wife where he couldn't understand why people didn't love Salal and Oregon grape, because he thought they were the most wonderful ground covers and low shrubs. Anyway, okay.
It depends on where, right? It's all about the where.
Right.
So we have a question here about the notion of inclusion and diversity. What we we touched early on in our conversation about democratic principles, but today we frame it somewhat differently. Are the Olmsted Parks a legacy that is inclusive? Do we think that they are uniformly welcoming, or are there still some issues there that we need to address?
Well, it's a tough one, but let me ask the question, what doesn't work and what's wrong with Sheep Meadow? Who can't use it? You know, there are no gates in Central Park.
Exactly.
Unlike all the parks in Europe that close at dawn or dusk or whatever, then
Yeah.
they shut them up.
Marion?
No, I'm not talking.
No, I'm just asking you to pick up because he's frozen.
Oh, asking me to pick up.
The people
I-
up who live in Harlem, is anybody who lives down on there, just go in and I think it's extremely inclusive as far as I can tell. Go into Central Park and who's in it? Everybody from the city of New York. I mean, what doesn't work there? I mean, the biggest problem is transportation for people who live too far away, I guess, you know. And there are some things that cost money, but they would cost money, you know, a hot dog costs money whether you're on a street or in a park. So I don't think that's the problem, you know.
You know, I've experienced an interesting thing with that many years ago when I was working on Forest Park in East Cleveland and Cleveland Heights. I went out and walked through and I realized there were a line of signs literally facing one way towards East Cleveland. And it said, you are entering Cleveland Heights and you're leaving East Cleveland. And the signs literally said, this is the line. I mean, it was a line of signs that, like, not a fence, but a line of signs going down saying you are leaving or you are entering one or the other community, which was built by the Rockefellers for both communities. And it was an interesting thing to experience. And I walked into the first community meeting and I said, wait, before we do anything else, let's talk about the signs.
Let's get rid of the signs.
Let's get rid of the signs. And I didn't realize how bad it was. I was out there walking around and all of a sudden a couple children came from the other side. There were no police around, but all of a sudden this ranger, this policeman comes out of nowhere and tells these two children to stay on their side. And it was, I'd never experienced that in the park. I don't know if you ever have, Laurie, but
Marion,
it was amazing.
That's not the physical design of the park,
Right.
though. That's,
Right.
No, the park was fine.
Yeah.
Taylor did a great job on that park.
You know, I think we have to admit that there is a kind of Gresham's, what would I call Gresham's law? And of activities in parks. Some things some uses drive out others. If I'm sitting quietly reading and somebody comes by with a radio and sits down next to me playing music, no matter how nice the music is, it's hard for me to go on reading.
Right.
And while they're listening to their music, if somebody comes by with a basketball, starts bouncing it around, it's hard for them to listen to their radio. And so there's this kind of thing where certain activities will drive out other activities, and that tranquility and calm is probably the hardest thing to achieve in our society at all today, anywhere, whether you're in a park or somewhere else. So we can't say, so how to deal with that? Well, in order to deal with all the different kinds of things people want to do in a society that has so many different ideas about well-being and what makes them feel good and what's fun, I think we need enough room for lots of different places. And that was part of the magic of Central Park. When I lived up on 102nd and Central Park West for a couple of years, you know, I would go into the north end of the park and people up there were using the park the way people in the south were using the park, but they were different people and they were sometimes doing very different things, but there was enough room for them to do them their way. And they weren't bothering other people somewhere else. And so part of it is how to give people of difference the chance to exercise their difference. And if you go into Prospect Park, you will find groups of people with barbecues and you'll find other people playing cricket. You'll find some people flying a kite and other people sleeping. You'll find, you know, if you go to the Long Meadow and walk all the way down and around toward the Grove and toward the Long River, the low water, you will go through at least 5 different ethnicities in that walk.
Right.
And it's only because there's room for them to coexist and not step on each other. you
Right.
know? And I think they actually kind of enjoy, there's a little frisson of, hey, what are those people doing? You know, everybody's kind of checking each other out. You know?
Right.
And I think that's inclusivity. But you can't do that if you build too small, if you overmanage, if you overprogram. You
Yeah.
can't have that kind of diversity.
Mhm.
I think you're right. It's a matter of proportion.
Yeah. In everything.
But concepts have changed too. I can remember
Yes.
when I first moved to Boston, and in '69, I told my neighbor I was going to take my daughter and her two kids over to the park. I was going to take them to the zoo. Okay. I'm an Olmsted fan, so I'm going to Franklin Park. I'm not going to that other zoo, you know? So I pile them in the car and we take off and we go there and come back. And I tell her, she said, well, how was the zoo? And I said, well, Franklin Park's great. She said, oh my God, you took my children to Franklin Park? Don't you know it's not safe? And, you know, our concept of that has changed
Yeah.
since the 1969, 1970. It's a completely different thing now. There's a very different attitude, I think, in the necklace from one end to the other in terms of everybody using the space.
It's better. Yeah.
It's better. It's gotten better.
Mhm.
Mhm.
You know, but this business of changing ideas and inclusivity, you guys probably know Mario Shetland. He's a friend of mine in Mexico, and he has just produced the largest skate park I've ever seen anywhere in any country in Chapultepec Park. It's huge, and it's full of people, you know, young people mostly on skateboards.
Right.
There's big fuss about skateboarders in a little park in downtown next to City Hall. And a lot of
Right.
people were all upset and trying to drive them out. And they were fighting, saying it's public land and we belong here. And so they built a skate park in Fairmount Park near the Art Museum. And I thought, I don't know if they'll go there, you know, telling people that you want to do it, you have to do it over here. Sure enough, they're there and it's full of people. It's well used. And the other park now is the Love Park at the end of the Fairmount Park next to the City Hall is not overrun with skateboarders anymore because they really have something that is better.
Yeah.
So the question was don't just throw them out, but give people something better. The competition for resources is part of the problem in our society to start with, you know, and parks and open space are an incredibly important resource.
Yeah.
And so go ahead, Dede.
Yeah,
Sorry.
No, I was going to agree with that and thinking about your point that you don't have diversity if you over program. I think that's an incredibly good and important point because I think that's one of the biggest challenges to Olmsted parks and parks generally, the over programming. And I think there was that capacity of the Olmsteds to think about systems. And so, for instance, Delaware Park could be more restorative, but Martin Luther King Park could have more activities. I mean, so you could accommodate different activities in different places, and not every park had to have everything. And I think we need to think about these spaces in that way, because if we do over program or if we do over privatize, then pretty soon we will have lost that diversity of experience that I think Olmsted was really trying to create.
Yeah, I found the introduction to the Kite Festival in Franklin Park really, really interesting, which happened in the early 70s. And it was amazing because it's a Japanese tradition to fly kites. So how do we get to Franklin Park with these kites? And it was amazing to me. It was better in the beginning. It's not as good as it is, was. It was an amazing amount of diversity of people flying kites. It was just a common thing, and it was all over the park and mostly in the golf course area. But I thought it was one of the best things that they did there in terms of bringing everybody together. The Kite Festival was great. It was families, every kind of person you can think of there doing it and flying a kite.
And I think Olmsted now, which has been the bicentennial moniker at the Emerald Necklace, has really worked hard at looking at community engagement and some of the barriers, if you will, to participating in the park. I mean, I think there's been this effort to have organizations have programs in the park, and just the permitting process. I mean, they examined that, and the permitting process was a little daunting and somewhat difficult for some communities. And so part of that outreach has been to make the permitting and make access to the city officials easier for everyone to participate in the park. So I think that's a wonderful example of how the folks in the Emerald Necklace area in particular have looked at some of these barriers, which I don't think are produced by the designs themselves, but are produced by the framework for using the park that may have made these places less friendly than they should be.
Great. I think we'll vector off in another direction. Is anybody, Tom and the team at VTASLA, did you want to open the floor for questions? We are a little over an hour in.
Yeah, this discussion has been excellent. And if you are wrapped with the active discussion, then yeah, I think I'd love to.
For
open
now,
it up.
I just wondered if you wanted to change it up and then go back to more dialogue.
I'm going to warn you that I keep going out and in.
all
You know,
But
Laurie, I think
moment.
you should stop muting yourself. I think
So-
you're causing the problem by going in and out
Okay.
continuously.
Maybe
Like-
not.
Try it
No.
just staying in.
Yeah, see, he's in and he just started to freeze.
Yeah, well, he's freezing too, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I
why
just
don't we-
wanted
Let's see
to,
if anyone has any questions now, but I'd love to have a longer Q&A at the end, but if anyone has anything kind of as we're working our way through.
bubbling up. I don't see anything. I mean, I have a very long chat going here, but I don't see any comments.
Well, you had some awkward questions of your own, Patricia.
Yeah, you
Oh,
got
yeah.
some great singers.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a number of issues when you come to the Olmsted legacy that I mean, it's not all good, right? There are still things we have to work on. I did ask a question about contemporary communities and where we're going in the future, which I think you've begun to touch on with this last dialogue. But one of the other points that's important, I think, to this group is thoughts about Olmsted's influence, continuing influence on the profession, and what we think that influence offers. We've heard from various voices, that's all about yesterday. We're about tomorrow. Laurie started to talk about this in what's not working with the sheep meadow, what's not working with the people of Harlem walking into Morningside Park. I think the enduring quality of the Olmsted parks and their ability to be flexible is a point that we continually have to look at. One of the questions that comes up when you start to work on this kind of a park is, can you align to the Secretary of Interior standards? Are you going to restore this to a prior point in history? Or are you going to adapt this park aligned to its character? So perhaps a little bit of discussion about, when we're talking about landscape architecture works and Olmsted parks of 100+ years, how does one think about the realm of preservation and what approach do we take?
Oh, boy. Well, preservation is a funny idea in landscape. I don't know if I wanted to do some kind of restoration of a park in Washington, D.C. I don't know how to do American chestnuts with passenger pigeons in them. It's a real problem. I can't get there. I can't get to 1870. So there's some things you cannot do in terms of landscape, in terms of, you can't go back. So we have to go forward. And if we're going forward, we have to understand what's going on ecologically. We have to understand what's going on with the climate. We have to understand what's going on with our society. And interestingly enough, with COVID, Suddenly we had a pandemic. Everyone was sick. People were terrified. No one.
Oh, darn. Right when he gets to the point, it cuts out.
He's not back
They
yet.
could play in each other. They could have community. So bicycles and pedestrians both, for example, without shutting one or the other out, seems to be the future. Has to be flexible, it has to be open, it has to be democratic, and it has to have the elements of nature that we need. That's the starting point. After that, I think you then begin to ask questions about, you know, the scale and furnishings and sociology and all sorts of things. You know, is this where people are going to take wedding pictures? Is this where people are going to play basketball? You know, what's this? What's it for? Who is it for? And in a democracy, one of the things to argue about is we should have conversations, discussions, and thresh it out about who benefits and who gains and who doesn't. You know, that's a democracy. We should do that.
Yeah,
Let's give
there are
arguments have to be more political. Olmsted was very political. Oh my God.
Yeah.
You have to dare get your hands dirty. You have to get involved. You have to meet people that maybe are not quite your kind of people who are actually doing work. That may not be your norm. And what's wrong with that?
Sounds good. Marion, do you want to pick up on that?
Well, I said in the beginning, I really believe in the continuum. I think I'm into history, but I'm into history from, you know, the caveman up to today. I think things, you don't throw out the good. You look at a park, you don't throw out the good. You work with the people. I think today we have a real advantage over Olmsted in terms of working with communities, which he did not have a real chance to do that. I think it's a whole different system when you do parks now. Community participation is, you know, I had somebody who was trying to do work in Boston call me up and say, hey, you know, it's like a combat sport, you know, you go to a community meeting and they're gonna beat you up. I said, you know, and it was amazing. This was a really good firm. I mean, a really high-end firm calling and saying, Marion, what are they doing? How do I deal with these people? And I think we have a distinct advantage over him in that sense, in that we deal with the community on a daily basis. We talk to them continually. I mean, everyone, from politicians down to the guy who's selling the icy balls as a vendor out in the park. So, I mean, I think we have that advantage, and I think it's what can make us go into the current century. And I do agree, you can't stop time, but you don't want to throw out the good either. You really have to look at what is still positive, still works, and not just go down and cut off all the trees just because you want to put a ball field in some place. You look at the site, you pick what's good, you keep what's good, and you try to develop what isn't. And I think that's what we have to do. I think that's what he would do. I really do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think community participation, to a certain extent, I think it's what you've just said, is a double-edged sword. The community participation is important, but it also, I think, needs a foundation of understanding about what the park is about, what the principles of the park were, why the pieces of the park are there. And without that information, the community input can essentially destroy the core of that park. And I think that's going to be the continuing debate for the friends groups and the conservancies. I think that's really incumbent on the National Association for Olmsted Parks to sort of help these groups deal with this balancing act, which I think is a very, very difficult one. I mean, talking about programming, when is programming so much that you've privatized the park and
Right.
made it really something other than a public park. So I
Well-
think that big question, what is the purpose of this park? And are we fulfilling it by putting in a big building? Or are we fulfilling it by putting in more playing fields? I think that's got to be the continuing question. And Olmsted certainly had an answer for what the purpose of the park, but I'm not sure that all of us have the clarity that he did.
Well, I'd like to add to that, that I think a lot of Americans and a lot of people around the world look at landscape and parks as empty. They don't see that they're already full, that they already have program. And so they think of them as building sites. And the thing is that most of the things that people come along and want to add to parks probably don't belong in the park. They belong across the street, or they belong in land that needs to be acquired. It means that there's a demand for more.
Oh, darn.
Can quite often what it means is that if someone wants to build new things in an existing park like Franklin Park or FDR Park in Philadelphia, where people right now are trying to put new soccer fields, add soccer fields in an area that other people have turned into a wetland and a natural zone of meadows, which is very close to the original plan of JC. One of the things is that actually that means that the Fairmount Park District needs to be acquiring land to build soccer fields, not building them in the land they already have. They already have used up the stuff, and there's more people that need more things. And so that's a failure of political leadership to understand the need of the population in proportion to their need. You know, the resources are being misallocated, and they're being overburdened for what they can do. And I think that's one of our problems. It's not a matter about preserving a park. It's a matter about expanding the facilities for an expanded population.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, so what you're saying is it should spark the attention to the need to get more space.
More parkland. Yeah.
Now, the more parkland issue is tricky.
That leads to problems of maintenance and support, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The supply of money to take care of it. Ah, yes.
Exactly.
That's the free lunch problem. That's it.
Of course, there are some cities that are adopting playgrounds as other areas for play. I mean, there are ways to take either non-used parkland, non-used areas in the city or existing recreational areas and use them more creatively. I mean, I think that's also a way to deal with the existing infrastructure and to rethink it, just as they tried to do with Queens Way or even with the High Line for that matter.
Yeah, so there is an important issue about that Laurie spoke to earlier, and it's been touched on more than once about a system, and Marion speaking to the Emerald Necklace. So one of the things I showed was that Buffalo map of where the bikeway was that would connect to the three parks in the
Right.
south. So what do you think how do you think the Olmsted constructs are being applied today to extend these systems as cities grow, as we continue to link them together into megalopolis, and how we go forward? There's an interesting movement in the heritage world to talk about the Herietopolis. What is the heritage of the metropolis, and how should we be bringing that forward? So just it's on the scale and on the as cities grow, what should we do? Go ahead, Laurie.
Well, I was going to say New York City.
We lost him again.
It's aggravating.
They're building new parks at a very large scale, which I think would
Right.
please Olmsted, and they're trying to figure out how to get people to them. That because one of the problems is that many of the Olmsted parks were built at the edge of a city, outside of the developed populace, the fabric, but right now we have these metropolitan areas that are full. And so what are you going to do? You're going to rip down part of the city to build the parks for the people who live in the city? You're going to put it on top of them? What could we do? So how to retrofit the cities we have to get the open space needed in the cities that have now grown and sprawled without the adequate parks is, I think, one of the problems of our time. How to rebuild the suburbs so they're more dense and they have more parks both. In other words, rip them partly apart and then densify part of them. I mean, there's a whole rethinking of the suburban, the ring around the bathtub, so to speak, of our metropolitan areas, because there's a ton of people who need a lot of things, and it's being, and the land is terribly used right now in terms of its density and sprawl. So that's clear, and I don't see a lot of people working on it.
I actually think there is some positive news. I think the bicentennial has prompted a lot of communities to be thinking about these things. And we've seen in Baltimore a brand new park called Hillside Park that's on the drawing board. This is going to be possible because a community foundation pulled together funds from a variety of sources at a very high level to be able to acquire this property and make it in the spirit of an Olmsted Park. And Louisville Olmsted Parks Conservancy have just added to their parkland. This is the first time in 30 years. Again, there was this prospect of development, but someone came through with a donation so that they could acquire 30 acres. They've just had an RFP to look at master planning and community engagement. So we are seeing some interesting examples even outside of New York, where the cities are seizing the opportunity to expand their parkland and to
That's true. Both Atlanta has done with the new beltway around Birmingham. A lot of people have been actually building new extensive, mostly linear systems, which is, it goes back to Marion's point a while ago of the continuous access and continuous movement.
I think even stodgy cities like Boston are doing that. We're taking over brownfields areas. And it's interesting, it's shifted to Massport, the Port Authority, who want to build more runways or want to do something. And they go to the neighborhood in East Boston and they say, we'll give you a park. We'll do another 4.5 acres. We'll do a 600-foot park. And the East Boston Pierce Park, which we're in second phase right now, and there'll be a third that's happening as well, is basically a new, totally new park on derelict land and contaminated land. And I think that's happening a lot. We have a number of those kinds of things happening in Boston because our edges are contaminated. They're not used. That's what happened to New York. That's exactly why they have all those spaces. And I think many cities are doing that, even the oldest ones.
So
I
then
think this is in part an extension. I mean, have we learned from the fact that we have these kernels of extended connected systems, but there are broken connections, and this is a way of moving forward.
Well, what Massport is, what the city in Massport also did is did the Greenway, which ties together Bremen Park and East Boston Pierce Park. So all of a sudden, the old rail line is now a connection between two parks that are totally new parks on land that was really derelict, and is its own little mini park system. East Boston had very little park in space in their area. I mean, in the 70s, it was only Somerville was worse when it came to the amount of parks. And they have expanded it and done it through state agencies, which is sort of interesting. Or through the T, the Metropolitan Park, train system. So it's an interesting thing that all of a sudden you have a thing, that authority that is not a parks department by any means. But interestingly, the lesson to be learned here is that Massport understands what maintenance is all about. And there is a complete maintenance plan. They have their own maintenance people for these parks. And when we finished the first one, they came to me and said, how much money do we need per year to maintain this park? And it was $500,000 was set aside in '97, that this was going to at least be a start for maintaining the park. And I think that's something we have to do as we do these parks. We have to also build into them the fact that we're going to maintain them.
Yeah.
and the mechanism. Right.
Right, so that actually leads us into another issue, because we know that the maintenance teams, the skills, the number of people, the human resources that were applied to these systems in the original build out of the systems, or in the case of an estate that's now public that used to have, 90 people on the ground that has 10 today, how do you think we can work through some of the challenges of maintenance? I know that when we talked earlier, I spoke about the work in Chicago, and that the Chicago Park District told us from the outset that the park, at least a significant amount of the acreage we were touching, was going to be managed by controlled burning. So on a cyclic basis, they wouldn't burn all of the park, but they would burn certain areas and then go back another year and burn other areas, and then do it on a 3 to 4 year cycle. So well, of course we were shocked when they told us this, but then we worked with the ecologists from the Chicago Park District, but also from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, to figure out what the plant communities were that could withstand that kind of treatment. So I guess it's a broader question, but that's one example of what are you going to do because you don't have the people or the skills.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, short of a massive public investment that I don't think any of us is anticipating, I mean, some creative public-private partnerships that I think are going to happen. And just looking at some of the national partners behind Olmsted 200, the Garden Club of America being a good example, I mean, they have a number of clubs on the ground working with their local parks. There's a national program called Weed Wrangle. They've entered into a partnership with the National Park Service to sort of bring in volunteers to help deal with these invasive issues. And I think that's one step, obviously, to address some of these concerns. I know Seattle and the Friends of Olmsted, Seattle's Olmsted Parks are busy looking into a framework for the replacement of tree loss, because the parks there have had an estimated loss of 500 trees per year for some time, with only a fraction replaced. And so they're looking at a creative system to help remedy that problem. So I think that those kinds of creative community interactions are going to be necessary to deal with clear sustainable questions of maintenance that require more people and more resources than currently our public officials can provide.
Excellent. We've also had good experience with the Student Conservation Association and with teams that are Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy has done a very good job with local teams, either from offices or industry, to bring them into the parks as tree keepers or weed team members.
Right. The same thing happened with Point State Park. There was no way the DCNR was going to be able to maintain it. The city, it had even less ability to do it. And we had a complete understory of a woodland that had been planted. We had the trees, we had the understory, and we brought in master gardeners. We got them interested in it. They have taken it over literally and are doing a magnificent job with it. They're not only keeping invasive out, but they're keeping the plants alive. And the hardest part, of course, is to not let it get pretty. Is this business of wanting to bring in, oh, we need some, mums. Why can't we bring some mums in? So there's still talk. You have to talk with your people that are doing this, so that they understand what they're doing. And we're not trying to create anything necessarily beautiful and flowery. We're trying to create the native woodland that was there when the French and Indian War was going on.
Yeah, so you have to recognize that white woodland aster, while it's not a mum, it's a flower and it's good.
Oh, we have lots of wood asters in there.
I know, I'm sure you
but
do.
native flowers, perennials, but
Well-
they're all native. We also, in that particular time, when I worked on that, worked with the indigenous people. The first time I ever got into it, we literally had them come to meetings. We had special meetings with them. Members of the couple different tribes came in, and we were hoping to do something in this one area that was more with indigenous plant material. Things sort of fell apart at the end, but we didn't get what we really wanted. But it was really tremendously interesting to work with them and to talk about the medicinal properties of the plants. And when the original designers had done this, they had actually taken it into consideration. They had a botanist, a very good botanist, working on that particular part.
Well, all of this makes me think that, here we have a problem with unemployment, we have a problem with jobs, and now we've got all these jobs to be done. And that, and then there's an education issue, and gee, there's things to be taught. So if somehow putting teaching together with learning, with hands-on, that leads to a job that you can get paid doing something that is creative and is beneficial for society, gee, seems to me that there's opportunity knocks. You don't have to be FDR to figure that one out.
No.
And that so here we are with a situation where a lot of nonprofits are trying to help parks in some public-private partnership. And one of the things they should be doing is doing a horticultural education parks project with young people or with prisoners who are being rehabilitated. Or John Collins here in Philadelphia for many years ran a program with a couple of local prisons to train people for jobs after they were released, to give them something where they could actually go get paid, and they had credentials, and they knew what they're doing, and it wasn't a nasty job, it was a good job. And it seems to me that there are many opportunities that the various horticultural programs, all the parks, Bryant Park and what's the other one, Central Park Conservancy, both train people. The Longwood Gardens trains people. That people are being trained all over the place to do this. And what we need to do is get many communities that are struggling with resources to latch onto this as part of an educational thing that they could be doing with school systems or colleges.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting. You look at the Olmsted firm in Ohio, it was working often with WPA teams. And so there is that precedent, and it's something that could be invoked today. And I think, again, Seattle had something called the Equity Task Force. And one of the recommendations is that those who are working on the public parklands be actually trained in the history as well as the horticulture. And I know in Keeney Park and Hartford, there's been a local garden club that has helped provide education, horticultural and otherwise, for those who are working on the ground. So I think you're right, Laurie, that there are opportunities to build a pipeline of folks in the horticultural and community.
We should design these really cool green jumpsuits, like the green men, like in Paris, the green men who go around and take care of stuff. It'd be a fabulous thing. I can see the hats, really cool hats.
Well, the green, it will become the new black instead of orange, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
that's right.
No,
So Laurie and Dede and Marion, I guess one of the problems we have is the disconnect with nature. And
Yeah.
in urban life in particular, which is part of what's causing all the carbon and all of the climate emergency and all of these related issues. Is there any thinking around if this kind of learning and training process, how do we uplift the caretaker in society? Because in general,
so they're not just thought of janitors outdoors.
yeah, we denigrate the caretakers. We uplift the stars.
Just look how we treated our nurses and doctors through COVID. Oh my God. So I mean, where does? But this whole nature seems to be. Who doesn't treat? some people say, oh, it drops stuff on my cars or they fall in my house. So there's this, we have a problem with about having people see the enormous benefit of trees. If you're talking about climate change, what can we do about helping our cities and climate change? It seems to be plant trees, Jesus, get going. Because they will lower the temperature, the heat island effect, they will provide shade, they'll lower your cost of heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. They'll make it more beautiful, your property values will go up. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. So for the few houses that get helped by a tree that versus for a community in terms of dollars and health and medical costs and heating bills, it seems to me that can't we make a case for trees first and then just get people involved in that? I mean, before we even worry about all the other plants.
I think solar panels are one of our big problems. They come over to, people come over and tell me, well, we'll put solar panels on. Well, if you cut down that beech tree that was planted in 1899 and get it out of the yard, we'll be able to put solar panels on your house and get sun.
This is a matter of putting the right thing in the wrong place, isn't it?
Exactly.
But the health issue is such an interesting one. I mean, there's the tree issue, and then I think there's the health issue. And I think, again, Olmsted was way ahead of his time, way ahead of the medical community in understanding that proximity to nature could make you feel better mentally and physically. Yes. And so the science has finally caught up with him in this regard. And I think we need, though, to keep remembering that Richard Louv, whom we all know as having done nature deficit disorder, I mean, he said that Olmsted was, again, one of his heroes, but that continually reminding us of the benefits of access to nature, something that Olmsted personally understood, is something we need to do. And Laurie, you mentioned Longwood. I was just talking to them. Some of their most popular courses are their mindfulness courses, where students and teachers come in. They cannot have their cell phone. They journal in the natural surroundings and they write about it. And these have been very, very popular. And again, this is something that our parks can help to promote amongst the younger generation, to leave those cell phones behind and go in and experience that restorative quality that Olmsted wanted everyone to have access to.
Thanks. Interesting. We've gone in some directions we weren't anticipating, but it's terrific. We are coming up on 8:40. So I think, Tom, it would be great if you have a question, or Elena, or Eugenia Martin, who's with us. Let's open the floor for some back and forth.
Yeah, well, again, like I said at the start, thank you for coming and sharing all your thoughts and anecdotes and in the history of Olmsted. Really such a both entertaining and educational discussion of the highs and the lows. It shows that we as landscape architects, really are conscious about thinking of all the issues relative to the environment and social, and trying to do the best for everyone. And Olmsted was really the start of that, and each of you is doing that, and hopefully my generation and after me can continue along. So thank you very much for taking the time to prepare and also present tonight. Really appreciated it. And yeah, if anyone has questions, I don't know that I've seen anything come in, but it's getting a bit late, but I'd love to hear from other people, comments, questions, whatever you have.
Someone's got to have a question.
And I guess maybe we can briefly go around the room.
I think.
I have actually one question. You've talked about all these things in the future of different things. Do you have any thoughts on how the actual parks themselves can go into the future? You've kind of talked around it a bit, but I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts on how they might evolve. Should they change some more? Should they keep them? How do you tell what you need to keep because it's such a good feature and what you don't need to keep? Because Olmsted didn't necessarily hit home runs every time. So how do you work those things together and decide how to move them into the future?
So we had a conversation earlier about they weren't all A+ parks. There were some B- parks. We also had a conversation about some of the parks were designed for African Americans as segregated parks. They weren't all universally open. The good news about the Olmsted firm designing a segregated park is that the African American populace had a park. The bad news is that they had to design a segregated park. But I think that Jim's question is more to the point of what do you do with the B- park that really maybe didn't get fully built? Often that is the case, that there's an Olmsted work that was never fully built, or that there were some land added to. What do you think about that? Or you're muted.
Okay.
I think, I said something about the community before, and I think one of the things that we do have the advantage now, and I think something that they don't teach us in school, is how to deal with communities. I think there needs to be some classes added on how, not only how you do a presentation, but how you talk to people and bring out from them what they're looking for. While you have your sense of design, you have to still be able to, bring through the landscape piece. But I think the way we're going to get these new parks, or the way they're going to develop, is we're going to need to talk to the people who are going to be using them.
Well, you have to learn to listen.
Yes, exactly.
But how do I say this? A few years ago, we had a project at the University of Chicago, and there's a thing called the Midway Plaisance, which at one point had a bunch of how to say, it was a midway, and it had a lot of things in it that sold trinkets and entertained people and food and stuff. And it connected two parks after the fair, and it was originally to be a canal. The canal never happened, and it was empty. It was just lawn from one end to the other. And my partner, Dennis McGlade, worked with the community and found out that, well, gee, they could do an ice rink in one, they could do a winter garden in one, they could do something else in another, and that whole strip of empty land called the Midway Plaisance, which was just a DMZ between one part of Chicago and another part of Chicago until they start building in the south of it. That actually they could build a bunch of community facilities in this empty, what was supposed to be a park was a piece of empty land. And there was a rare example of an Olmsted fragment that had and so looking for what could happen. Right? Yeah. So that's looking for opportunities that have not been taken up. It's not in place of something else, by the way.
Well, that was really part
It
of
didn't
the
happen.
1893.
Only 6 pieces happened this time too.
Well, and that's a debate that is continuing. I mean, right now there is a plan to put a very large playground. And there are those in the Midway Plaisance. In fact, the Park Advisory Council has noted that they believe it's essentially a wetlands that would be replaced with a very large playground, and they're opposing it. So the debate goes on, Laurie, in the Midway Plaisance itself in terms of what is there and what's not there. And I think that's going to be the ongoing debate for all of us who love these parks. Or what is the balance? What is an appropriate change, or what is a change that destroys the essence of the park?
I mean, that was really part of the 1893 World's Fair and had a purpose for that reason. And I think that's why when you look at that, I think Laurie's right. You've got to look at all the pieces. And if a piece has failed and is empty at this point, you need to go back and look at it again. This happened with a lot of the World's Fair properties, if you think about it. I mean, there's a number of examples. The one in Queens is not much different.
Right, and the question a minute ago was, well, how do you know which to keep and what, how do you make your decisions? And I think those have to do partly with the inherent quality and nature of the parts. For instance, if it's a piece that is senescent, there's a series of trees that are 150 years old and they're all falling apart. The question is, do you replace them in kind or does something else happen? And what they stood for and what they contributed to the park before when they were healthy, how do you reconstitute that contribution? Whether it's the
Darn it. One of the things I learned from Rafe Cobham, who was from UK, was that they English plan and plant for 100 to 150 years. And at Blenheim with the Great Allée, it has moved itself every 50 or 100 years. It's not where it started. It moves out, it moves back in, it gets replanted. So the decision has to be made whether the alley is important enough to keep. And if it is, how do you do it? You don't put little teeth in between. You take it down and you put a new one here. I mean, you just have to start over. They did that at the Petit Trianon. They literally tore the entire thing out and replanted the entire thing all over again. I mean, it's amazing what the French do.
So we do have another question here that's been added. Christopher Crowley is interested in how Olmsted's ideas that are mostly directed toward big city problems, how could those apply to a small town in Vermont?
Well, what do people in a small town in Vermont need when they go outside every day? And what do they?
Yeah,
I would say, are there children in Vermont? Well, my hunch is there's a bunch. And the children in small towns need to be able to explore and to do things that are on the verge of dangerous. And they need to be able to climb and fall out of things. They need to be able to run, jump, play, get wet, get muddy. There are things like that. And those are really good things that you can build into parks. I don't know if are there dogs in Vermont? A lot of people like to go out and walk their dogs, and they need a path and they need a nice place that when they're walking the dog, while the dog is busy, you can look around and actually see something like what's in bloom. There's birds, the migratory songbirds are coming here. Oh, it's that time of year. Gee, oh, look at the flocks of things on the pond here. So it seems to me that what would a small town in Vermont want? Seems like I don't know, something bigger than my backyard. That's what they want.
So Robert Pierce has a question.
I know that sounds condescending, but I'm not kidding.
No, I think you're right.
Start with going out the door with your kids. Start going out the door with your dog. And what is it? How you want it within a 5 to 10 minute walk. And when you get there, you want it to deliver the following, and you just name what you want. I want to see the sky. I want to see water. I want birds. How do I get birds? Well, I need something that will attract birds. And you just kind of go down the list, right? And
exactly.
And usually it turns out that if you can't make a space big enough, you can make a linear thing, or you can make a linear thing to take you to the space. Right? I don't know. Just connect the dots.
Yes, we have another comment, actually. I think it's a bit, doesn't really range into the realm of a question. Robert Pierce is saying he was also wondering about parks as generators or triggers of urban gentrification. That's true. That's actually true from the beginning, that park development increased the value of the neighboring property.
Right.
And he's thinking of the High Line, and in the case, do the landscape architects address that? I think the landscape architects become the agents of the development process, in a manner.
Okay.
So gentrification issue.
Let me jump in. In the recent plan for the LA River that our office just did, one of the 6 points was to produce affordable housing. And we have got the city council, or not the city council, the county commissioners to appropriate
Oops.
For property for housing, because we realize that parks have become part of the for homeless and people who problems. So one of the things is that if you're going to work on parks, then you have to work on how to help the people who might be displaced by the park to stabilize their community and to help provide facilities for the people who might be having an effect on the park that is driving the middle class out and are making people afraid of the park. So you have to help everybody. You can't just help the people who know how to use a park. You have to help everybody. And so you're right, gentrification is a huge problem. And so one of our projects, I would say as landscape architects, is to work on the community stabilization, which quite often has to do with helping direct development in other places and helping to help with housing. Period.
I think that's right. I mean, if you look at the 12th Street Bridge project, which is going on here in Washington, D.C., they've attempted
One
to
of our
come up with some formula to deal with the affordable housing issue. I mean, I think it's tragic when green gentrification is sometimes raised as a reason not to improve a place. I think, Laurie, your point is that there are ways to address it, and it's going to require creative public officials working with landscape architects to make this happen. I mean, I don't want to let landscape architects off the hook, but this is not something that can be done simply by the landscape architect. It has to be done by the local officials, and we need to see some creative work in order to ensure we don't displace the communities when these places are improved.
Maybe we need to go to FLO Junior and look at what he did with planning, not just look at senior, but understand what he was doing when he was working in cities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a good notion, Marion, that the comprehensive planning that FLO Junior often did to enlarge park systems and transportation networks is something that's been missing. At least the opportunities to do that have been missing. So
yeah, I think he advanced beyond what his father was doing. I think his father was trying to keep him where he was, and I think he advanced into a very different thing, which was, I think, a real positive.
Well, people may not know that FLO Junior was, I've forgotten the name of the group that precurses the American Planning Association. But
oh yeah.
FLO Junior founded it.
He was a founder of that, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then that became the American Planning Association.
Yeah.
We've
So
got
there's a legacy. There's a legacy we tend to ignore. I think we need to look at Junior, and we need to look at John Charles, because all three of them, I feel, are, different directions in many ways, and they are all equally important.
As I like to say, this is the living legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted.
I think we have time for one more question, which is bound to get an interesting response from you all. Susan O'Brien asked a bit earlier, following on our discussion about plantings. She said, you mentioned Olmsted's lack of knowledge of native plants, using parks as an artist uses a canvas, but should we look at public parks the way we look at zoos, that there are places where the inhabitants might not be native or natural to the surroundings, but there to provide opportunities to expose and educate?
Very interesting.
The people's parks, as I said, in the 1840s in England, were educational. There's a number of books written on what the purposes and goals of those parks were. They wanted to get them out of the pub and into the park. They had some really great sayings. The lungs of the city. They wanted to educate people about a lot of things, including gardens and plants. And I think I think that's really, they're educational. They can be very educational. Part of the programming.
And I think as we focus more and more on climate change, understanding some of the basics, how these places operate as a green sponge, what this means when carbon sequestration, all of these things should be part and parcel of the way we make people appreciate these great spaces and why we need to keep them.
Education, very important.
And it's interesting because Marion, in recent I guess, months, maybe over the past couple of years, we've stopped using education. As a term, we use learning. Because,
Sorry, I'm back in the Middle Ages somewhere.
well, it's interesting because it's about inclusion again. Because if you bring together a group of 20 people for a class, everybody there might have something to contribute. The person who organizes it and runs it isn't necessarily the only knowledge holder.
No, I agree, but you've got to have a leader.
Of
You
course.
can't be running around into each other. Somebody's got to gather them together and get them talking. There still has to be somebody to keep it going. In a community meeting, it's the same way. It can't be just a free range kind of situation. Somebody's got to run it.
It needs leadership.
Yeah, leadership. That's the word.
Which means sticking your neck out and also refereeing, sort of going
Right.
between saying, look, thank you for that. That's interesting. I hear why you say, I don't actually think I agree.
Whoop. Darn.
Well, that's one of my favorite things about Olmsted, when occasionally the community didn't understand what he was trying to do. He created his own brochures and he sits there, whether it's in Belle Isle or other places, and he petitions for his own efforts on why they're good. Maybe that's what landscape architects have to do more of. Do your little petitions and stand out there in the indicating to the community why this is important and why they should follow your plan.
And there are some of us that actually do that.
Yeah, people have to learn, if you want to use that term.
Yeah.
And you can't send a bunch of people out to do maintenance on a park without a director telling them what to do to make sure they don't get poison ivy or poison oak or whatever it is, and that they don't cut everything to pieces. So there always has to be somebody leading the learning.
Yes. So with that, I would like to thank the three of you and a lot for this really rich discussion. And thank everybody who attended. I think I did see us hit up to 30. So there's a good group that stuck with us for our 2-hour session. And with great appreciation.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Signing off.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
And again, if you do need credits, don't forget to email the chapter and we will send that form out to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Darn. Okay, leave meeting.